Afternoon, everybody. I want to thank you for our second episode here of In the Clouds with AWS. I've got Brian here, we're going to have a discussion today about some topics on migration. I'm going to be hosting everything. Jon Spallone here. I've been on a couple of the other podcasts. You've heard me, as well as some of the webinars we host here at XenTegra. But really what we're going to do here is really focus it around things that relate to compute, relate to business enhancements, as far as it's concerned within AWS and how those benefits are presented for you. And again, this comes to our sole factor of enablement, making sure that you're aware of what's out there, making sure that you're getting the latest and greatest updates of information to help you with those decisions so we can work at those cloud solutions at our partners platform within AWS. So today's topic in migration, I think, is a good one. So Brian, if you would please introduce yourself. First time here with one of our podcasts.
Yeah. Thanks, John, and thanks XenTegra team for having me. My name's Brian Schoepfle. I lead a team of solution architects here at AWS Worldwide Public Sector in the partners organization. And my team supports partners in almost every time zone. We have team members in the US, we have team members in the UK, we have team members in Singapore. And although our team is public sector focused, I think everything that we're going to be able to discuss today is universally applicable and certainly not limited to any particular vertical or segment.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So if you see down here, we've got our screen shared up with this blog. This was posted out on the 17th of this month. And basically what we're talking about here is my large scale migrations. I know specifically, we just went through a project with one of our customers using the VMware ONTAP, migrating some of their side of the house. So it is complicated, but it's got to be planned. And this is some of the things that we're addressing here. Really, what I like here is we're discussing about the methodology process. Would you agree, Brian, of at AWS for migrations? Now, when we're talking about this, what would you consider a scale large migration of what they're talking about within this blog here itself?
Well, what's large to some may be small to some others. Certainly working in the public sector, what some of our DoD customers who have 90 to 200,000 service members that in a particular project working on something, what they do could certainly be considered very, very large. But if you are if you're a customer or potential customer with 100 virtual machines, but a small, relatively small IT staff with not a lot of not a lot of cloud or AWS skills, that can seem very large and very daunting. So what's large is I think certainly context specific, but the best practices and the mechanisms that we employ after listening to thousands or tens of thousands of customers who've gone through journeys just like this, I think are universally applicable.
Yeah, I would agree. It does. Size matters to the person that's working with it, really. So when AWS here, the approach here we're looking at is within getting started within the migration. A lot of what I'm seeing here is the same methodology and approach that we take of assessing, Mobilize. So from the assessment side of the house, it's really getting a discovery, when you say, of what's out there in the organization from that on-prem side of the house.
Yeah, absolutely. There are some things that we can talk about in terms of a cloud to cloud migration, but I think predominantly, whether it's an organization or a company that's really just getting started with cloud and trying to get a production workload into the cloud for the first time, or somebody who's got some quick wins under their belt and is now looking to migrate more complex application architecture. When we get started with a migration, one of the things that we really want to try to account for, regardless of the workload, regardless of the customer type, is reducing business risk. And one of the biggest places that business risk is going to come from in a complex project such as this is the amount of time that the project is going to take. Typically the most expensive resource any organization has is not a virtual machine with 32 cores that's got to be on all the time. It's a senior level engineer or architect who's going to be working on this project. So, when we talk about migrations, John, I think it's important to zoom out and really consider or take a deeper dive maybe into what AWS considers to be like part of the customer success journey in a migration. And as we're seeing in this blog post, first, we're starting with assess. The migration itself does not begin with you, turning a virtual machine into a VMDK and importing it into an AWS AMI. What the migration really starts with is the cloud adoption framework. And I think one area that, some customers have really tripped in the early stages is treating that cloud adoption framework or the cloud adoption framework process as just a series of workshops that they need to get through. And really a cloud adoption framework envisioning or align workshop that you would do with an AWS solutions architect, AWS ProServe, or one of our partners is meant to kickstart these internal discussions. And so, one of the things I like to point out as part of this process is we, start to account for business perspectives, and we really want to make sure that the right viewpoints are represented in the room. It's kind of a shift for a lot of IT organizations to be including folks like HR in a discussion about a technology change. But, typically in an organization, if we're talking about adopting new technologies, adopting new processes to produce new business outcomes, we're going to talk about upskilling existing employees, like giving them new skills, or going out of the market and finding these folks that do have these skills. And of course, HR needs to be involved in this. So, beginning a migration by reading up on the cloud adoption framework, which was recently adopted or updated for now CAF 3.0, where we've released an ebook, we just released an audiobook.
Yeah.
The CAF is available now in 20 languages. So if English is not your primary language, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be able to find some resources in your language. And of course, there's a Kindle version. Yeah. So like getting a good understanding of connecting these desired business outcomes with the technology that we're going to be embracing is really, really critical. So before we start to do anything about application lifecycle, certainly before we start to migrate any kind of data or virtual machine, we want to make sure that we're connecting what we're doing in the technology organization with the outcomes that the business needs. So certainly the cloud adoption framework is probably the best place for any customer to start. And what's great about the cloud adoption framework is we have so many partners like XenTegra who have this ability to lead these discussions with customers.
Oh, that's great. I mean, it really is the fundamentals of cloud, and that's when you talk about fundamentals, that's that first step. And because you are going to have that change, like you said, bringing in HR, the change of the staff, not in a bad way, but just in an upscale way for them moving forward. Mm-hmm. So from that next step, we're looking at from that approach of Mobilize, and basically what we're talking here is starting to build that plan as far as the migration is concerned. Is that what I'm seeing, right?
Yeah. So we talked about reducing business risk, and obviously, like we're talking about controlling costs during a migration. We'd like that the whole migration process, start to finish, to be as short as possible, or as short as is reasonable, because we want to avoid stall outs, right? So what are some of the ways that customers kind of get stuck if they haven't done the best job possible, or have forgotten to account for certain things as part of the early stages? We see kind of three different kinds of stalls in a migration effort. And the first is what we call pilot stall. So we've got a lot of energy in the organization, a lot of enthusiasm about getting things into cloud. We've got a lot of pilot projects, but because maybe there's no top-down control or top-down strategy being set. We've got a lot of projects in pilot. There's not a lot of coordination between these things. And so we're just perpetually experimenting, which is great, but struggling to get out of the gate in terms of putting together a coherent, cohesive cloud strategy is how we're going to migrate these applications into the cloud. The second type of stall comes from what we call cloud gridlock. So when organizations embark upon a cloud migration, typically what's become kind of, I don't know, almost cliche is to talk about lift and shift, right? What are the workloads that are not going to require any kind of refactoring and they can kind of just be rehosted right out of the gate? Well, there's what's been described by others much smarter than me is a lift and shift shot clock. So we get those early wins by doing the lift and shift, but the clock starts ticking at that point. Certainly we're hopefully able to take advantage of some kind of return on investment just by getting out of the blinking lights business. Mm-hmm. But if there isn't a plan to reinvest those savings and there isn't a plan to kind of detail, like do these retrospectives, what did we learn? How can we apply this to more complex workloads? And then also, we talk about, it's not just the technology that's changing, it's the process that's changing. And one thing, I've been helping customers get to the cloud since 2014. I've worked for cloud providers. I worked for a partner before I came to AWS. Is, one of the things I would always try to impress upon folks is if you're kind of bringing your own BS into somebody else's square footage, that's not making it any more efficient, right? And it may even make it less efficient. So if our operating model has not adapted to the new technology platforms that we're using, we're still using these legacy methods, then we kind of get into this cloud gridlock where all we've really done is maybe turn down a couple of racks in our data center, but we haven't really, it's not what I would call, with next generation infrastructure, next generation processes. We haven't really started to even, modernize really, which is the next phase that we're going to talk about. And the third type of stall is cloud chaos. And this is where certainly there's not been a lot of core planning. The organization may have kind of paid lip service to establishing a cloud enablement engine or a cloud center of excellence, but there's really a lot of lack of coordination. And if we thought we were going to break down a lot of silos by moving to the cloud, but have not embraced really what that new operating model is going to be, these new silos arise. And so we've got, different parts of the organization with different standards as far as how they're going to the cloud. And then they get kind of stuck because there's so many things going on in the cloud and there's no management and governance strategy. So when we set all that up in the assess phase, then when we get to the mobilize phase, hopefully we've built a business case and we're going to start to learn from experience. So before even we start to mobilize, there are certainly some steps that we would recommend and some customer and partner facing programs from AWS that customers should really take advantage of to help make that mobilize phase as easy as possible. And one of the things, one of the tools that I come back to all the time in this is the optimization and licensing assessment. So you really can't effectively plan for a cloud migration without an assessment, right? I think that makes a lot of sense to folks. But where a lot of folks have gotten kind of sticker shock and said, okay, maybe cloud is not right for us, is they've run some assessment tools. And there are great tools out there, both from AWS and from our partners to help, just to help understand the landscape of the IT environment. Like, what do we have out there? What's running? But if the plan is to do this lift and shift migration, I think it's important for customers to understand that even in a so-called lift and shift migration, you're not going to lift and shift everything, right? Yeah. So assessment tools may pick up things like zombie machines. They may pick up things like VMware template VMs. Certainly in an on-premises environment, customers are provisioning more infrastructure than they really need to support their workloads for high availability, disaster recovery, redundancy, that sort of thing. So when we talk about a lift and shift migration, it's important to kind of narrow the frame a little bit and really try to explore what is it actually that we're going to lift and shift. And as part of that, keeping in mind, we're not just lifting and shifting infrastructure, we're probably bringing some software licensing around along with us. And, there's such a high degree, across all customers, all segments of customers that are running Microsoft workloads. Microsoft is certainly a first-class citizen on AWS, but I don't think I'm breaking any news here by saying that Microsoft licensing can oftentimes be quite costly, right? I think that MSRP, the last time I checked, MSRP on like a single core of SQL Server Enterprise for a year is like $13,000. So it's important to understand, like, what is my licensing landscape going to look like when I get into the cloud? And the OLA, the optimization and licensing assessment is really, really important, because let's talk about, what does that on-premises environment look like? How old is that hardware? Is that hardware 2, 3, 4, 5 years old? We may be able to get the same performance or better on a smaller number of cores on modern infrastructure inside of AWS. So if we can look at, zooming out a little bit to look at what is the total cost of ownership of this landscape, there's just a really, really compelling business case here to take the time to really to really try to understand what are my costs actually going to be. So, we actually see, like, from an infrastructure optimization perspective, when we do these assessments, a 36% reduction in infrastructure costs, so 36% in compute savings. And when we run these optimization and licensing assessments, on average, we're able to produce a 49% reduction in SQL cores, and that's across standard and enterprise. And as I just mentioned, this is not inexpensive licensing. So as you build that business case, it's important to understand, what is it actually that I'm going to be bringing, and how much is that actually going to cost me? And that really helps customers build the business case for, boy, we are going to start to recoup these savings a lot sooner than we thought we would. And therefore, we might be able to accelerate the migration timeline.
Yeah, we use some tools ourselves to help with those costs predictions from instances and their loads based upon, grabbing within the environment. But the other thing too that I like about a migration to cloud is, and you brought up exactly like the Microsoft licensing cost side of the house, there are things that we can leave Microsoft out of when we bring it over and utilize native tools within AWS, such as our databases, our file services. These are things that we can actually trim out that Microsoft overhead and go into a native solution on AWS that you guys provide the services for. So that's why I definitely feel it's always best to do that cost analysis up front and see where we can trim the fat that doesn't need to be there. Now,
certainly.
So it mentions this landing zone. Is that along the lines of where some of these tools and utilizations are?
Yeah. So the landing zone is an architectural construct, inside of an AWS environment that is built off of, informed by the AWS multi-account strategy, and it's really the best way, I feel, to get started with good governance from the very beginning. It is much easier to start with a great foundation than it is to try to implement better governance, a better foundation, once workloads have been migrated. So whether customers feel like they already have a really strong understanding of what it means to use AWS Control Tower, what it means to use AWS organizations and the landing zone construct, or are working with a partner to help them do that. This is really like one of the first things that you should do, right? Like, before you migrate a virtual machine, let's build out the environment that it's going to live in. And for customers that are lacking the people, the tools, or the processes to be able to do that effectively, they're going to see slowdowns. They're going to see increased risk, because that risk is really going to come from a lack of cloud-ready architecture. Data breaches come from misconfigured resources. The AWS Managed Services, or AMS, which is available through partners, is an AWS managed landing zone environment to help customers elevate their operational excellence with 24/7 by 365 proactive monitoring of all activities and incidents inside of their environment. AWS, the AMS service will help customers with configuration, compliance, and auditing. Even for folks that have real compliance needs, like around PCI DSS, HIPAA, HITRUST, GDPR, SOC 123, what have you, and get customers started with if we are going through a lift and shift migration, getting that centralized operations management, getting the enterprise governance and controls right from the very beginning. And we've had customers such as Sally Mae, who used AMS, and they reported back to us that they were able to develop and execute a disaster recovery plan that improved DR simulations by more than 50%. And they've reduced overall costs by 30% and met their savings objectives within the first year, which is a really great story and just really speaks to getting through that assessment phase, getting into the mobilize phase as quickly and safely as possible, and leveraging partnerships to get that done. And the partnerships part of it is so critical, right? Like when I was on the partner side and we were doing a lot of different kinds of migrations, a lot of different kinds of upgrades, it oftentimes would strike me as just like baffling to me anyway, why a business would want to, for example, send their people to a 2-week training to figure out how to upgrade from Exchange 2010 to 2016. Like, how many times in your life are you going to do that? If you are going to, and I know this is a very popular phrase at AWS, if you are going to shift that undifferentiated heavy lifting to AWS and focus on your core competencies, you're going to get through that migration faster because you can focus your work on your applications and what's perfect for your construct, and let AMS build out this foundation for you that makes that migration so much easier.
Oh, definitely. No, I agree, because I came from both sides of the fence, and like you were talking about the Exchange side of the house. I did that 1 year, and then the next year when it was the next upgrade, I was like, forget it. Let's just get a consultant. It's not worth the time. And it really is. It's again allowing that customer the time to focus on their own business strategy. Because going back to that Mobilize side of the house, crap in, crap out. And if they're not focusing on that and they're focusing on these other things where a partner in AWS can help them out, then they can work on those processes that they have and getting those fine-tuned on their end. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about on the Migrate and Modernize, I'm seeing here like the application migration service, are we talking about this is where we would actually start to do some application mapping and understanding of that? Mm-hmm. Is that would I be right in that?
So hopefully at the assess phase, we've done a couple of different things. One, we've talked about like, what does my existing architecture look like, and what kind of architecture infrastructure could I expect to have inside of the AWS cloud? What's my licensing environment going to look like? And then as part of that, hopefully we're doing some sort of application dependency mapping, which makes it, which gives us a better window into a plan for what actual physical infrastructure that we own is responsible for supporting these workloads, and what can we expect to be able to safely turn down after we've migrated without impacting the performance of other workloads. I really wish it was possible that we could just flip that toggle switch and get into the cloud, but as you know, it's very much a dimmer switch, and we've got all these different dependencies across the environment. And then lastly, as part of that, hopefully we're doing some sort of application lifecycle planning, right? We're kind of going through like what's going to be rehosted. It's the 7 R's, right? Rehost, replatform, re-architect, retire, repurchase, ignore. It's not an R, but kind of going through and part of an interesting story about that. Several years ago, as I was working with a partner, it was a big service provider to a lot of credit unions across the country. We were doing some application dependency mapping and trying to go through an application lifecycle exercise. And we're going through like lists of it's hundreds of applications, right? And we get to one, the application is called Life 70. And it had some weird performance. It was on some really old hardware. We're asking the VP of IT who really brought into effect the cloud migration, like, what's the story with this Life 70 application? What is that? And he just started laughing. And what he said to me was, well, life refers to the type of product that it is, which is it's a life insurance management product, and 70 refers to the year that it was created. So this is something that's literally been limping along, on legacy mainframe hardware since its inception, written in COBOL or Pascal or God even knows what. And I said, well, speaking of application lifecycle, like what's the plan for this kind of applications? At the time, it was very difficult to modernize a mainframe application and bring it onto the cloud. And he said, well, there's really only one thing that we can do, and that is basically wait until everybody who's purchased this life insurance product is no longer with us, right? And that's kind of the ultimate application lifecycle, right? A very black and white, bringing the lifecycle conversation right to the forefront. But it is important to understand and map out when are we going to migrate these applications? What are we going to do with them? And what are we going to need to do with them once they get into the cloud? And there are a lot of tools from AWS and our partners that make initiating and orchestrating and scheduling these migrations much easier. AWS Migration Hub has been around for a couple of years now. What I love about the Migration Hub is that it can pull in data from the application discovery service. It can pull in data that we've manually created as part of a migration readiness assessment. It can pull in data from Migration Evaluator, formerly known as TSO Logic, which is the same tool that we use to execute an OLA, and then use Migration Hub Orchestrator to actually automate a lot of the manual tasks that would normally be associated with migrating these resources into the cloud. And the application migration service is absolutely a part of that.
Sweet. So the Migration Hub, is that fall in here on the how to migrate area?
Yeah, I would certainly say we would begin we start to feed data into Migration Hub as part of the assess process. We start to plan our migrations in Migration Hub and Migration Hub Orchestrator as part of that Mobilize process. And then when we're ready to actually effect a large scale migration, we would orchestrate that through Migration Hub Orchestrator and the AWS Application Migration Service.
Oh, that's great. It's great. I mean, and this is a huge benefit for a lot of people out there that are looking at these migrations. You guys pretty much have cookie cuttered it to go through. However, like you and I both know, there's always that boutique side of the house that every organization isn't aware of until they start going down this process.
The big part for me is really like, how do we get out of ClickOps, right? Like, it's on a relativity scale, it's much easier for us to test scripts and see where they have errors before we're ready to execute them than it is to kind of like, I don't know what you're supposed to do, like print out a PDF and laminate it and tape it to somebody's desk. It says like, click here, click there. So to be able to orchestrate these kinds of things, validate that the data has been moved safely, validate that the virtual machine's been imaged correctly and imported correctly, and all of this is going on, while we're sleeping or not working over the weekend, lets us feel much better about what's going on, because anytime we're talking about the human element, we're going to slow things down and add additional costs and increase the likelihood of error.
Yeah, definitely. So once we get out of this migration period, this is where we're going to start looking at costs. But again, like the last note here is that, if you're not following these steps, you're missing things or you're ineffective in this, you're going to have additional costs anyway. So it's just better to do that due diligence ahead of time. And, again, you came from, my side of the world beforehand. You know how difficult it is sometimes when you're teaching somebody and working with them, trying to help them understand. It's not wasting cycles. It's making sure that we're not spending more for this type of implementation. Because if we don't do those check boxes before we go into this migration phase, it's a nightmare. It's a total nightmare, because then you find things as you're moving at the last minute that you didn't know was there, could change things, licensing issues with it, upgrading versions that need to be done. So it can definitely, again, pointing back to your stalling standpoint, reintroduce that.
Yeah, I think, professionally speaking, one of the worst days of anybody's life in an IT operations department would be the day they have to go to their boss and ask for more money because the project is turning out to cost a lot more than they thought it would.
Yes.
And taking the time, um, the older I get, the more I realize that my grandma was right about just about everything she said. And I think everybody's grandma at one point has said a stitch in time saves nine, right? And so that getting that understanding what you're going into will not only help you have a really accurate business case, but save a lot of pain down the road. Like, nobody wants to be halfway through a production migration and then find out that some critical service is dependent on a DNS server that's running on a 6-year-old tower underneath somebody's desk.
Yep.
Or in a closet somewhere. So really understanding how traffic is flowing, how these services are being supported, allows us to make the actual migration element of the process one of the most pain-free processes as part of this, because we did the due diligence up front to understand what we were getting into. We planned appropriately, and whether we're using AMS or landing zone or however we've architected where we're bringing things, we know where it's going to land and we know where it goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when we did the project on the VM ONTAP, there was a lot of due diligence, and I worked with some of your counterparts at AWS as we went through to do that discovery, where we're going each step of the process. And that successfully went from the POC to pilot to now that project has grown to the next phases where we're going to start migrating additional services. So where we started out, like you said, it's not picking everything up at once and dropping it in the cloud. We started out in one particular area that they saw as a business requirement, did all of that discovery beforehand, and then actually migrated it. They validated everything with the technology. So now that production is starting to move, and now we can focus on the next stage of services that come into AWS Cloud. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about the costs on these migrations, so that's one of the things where, I think is key as well. It's not just the cost estimation on, what the cost of the instance is running in there on a monthly basis, the consumption, there's additional costs that we have in there, overhead as well. And I know it's outlining some of it here with the cost and productivity, general performance, reliancy and security, and business agility. So, I think there's those non-technology cost factors that are in there that need to be taken into account as well, which a lot of people don't think about when we're going into cloud.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I love about using the AWS migration readiness assessment, and this is something that our partners have access to, something that we run internally at AWS, is that it incorporates a lot of the things that are not going to come up on a software-based assessment. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've tried to impress upon folks, going back all the way to 2014 is, and this is, by the way, a great thing for you and I, Jon, from a job security perspective, but there is no software substitute for good judgment. And so, going through that assessment to understand, okay, we've right-sized our infrastructure from a core count perspective. We've right-sized our licensing. We've gone through those sort of mechanics of what does the infrastructure look like, but this is where the business needs to get involved and really coach people to zoom out and talk about what is the total cost of ownership of this solution. And the total cost of ownership is not going to be reflected entirely on the invoice that you get out of AWS, right? We got to talk about what are we saving in terms of power and cooling? What are we saving in terms of outages? What are we saving in terms of unused infrastructure? And that goes right back into that modernize phase that you touched on, which is, I think that just about everybody, when they get started with the cloud, and they start taking those trainings, whether it's the AWS business professional accreditation, or they're going all the way up to, solution architect professional, when they talk about the value of the cloud, like the first thing that everybody mentions is, well, you have this elasticity and this ability to only pay for the resources that you're using and, be able to scale up and scale down on demand. Well, how many folks in an on-premises environment are really scaling up and scaling down infrastructure on demand? So this goes back to the processes discussion, right? So I've got all my stuff into the cloud. And one of the reasons I decided to go to the cloud was I would be able to scale my infrastructure on demand and only pay for what I use. But I haven't changed anything about my infrastructure. I'm running completely like for like, and I'm in a steady state environment all the time.
Mhm.
Right? I'm missing out on those benefits. So that's, once I'm there, now I need to start talking about how do I really start to extract value from this. I've got out of the blinking lights business, power, cooling, all that stuff, carbon footprint. And I'm hopefully putting together a plan where I'm taking that ROI and putting inertia back into that flywheel of success, to be able to fund these modernization efforts, where I can start to maybe change the way that I've deployed my virtual machine architecture. Can I go to containers? Can I use spot instances? What can I bring about a so-called serverless or event-driven environment with API gateway and AWS Lambda and these sorts of things. So, when you talk about cost, I think, well, over what period and incorporating what data points, right? Because at any given point in time, our perspective can be very, very different than where we're going to be a year from now or 3 years from now. And that's what the cloud adoption framework is all about, is putting those pieces together to understand what we're going to do, right? So that we haven't affected this lift and shift migration where we've got everything in and we've turned everything off in our data center and everybody's standing around looking at each other going, now what? Right? Like we should know what now what is. And whether that's something as simple as starting to use auto scaling groups to add a little bit of elasticity to our infrastructure, or really start to embrace some of those more modern things that we talked about. And I'm sure in future conversations, we'll talk about the different classes of AWS storage and making sure that I'm using the right type of storage for my workload that's going to give me the performance that I need, but I'm not spending more than I ought to. And that's on everything from object storage, file storage, block storage, and so many of the purpose-built databases that we have. So it's never ending. But that shouldn't be daunting to folks, because those of us that would like to continue to be employed would like to have jobs that continue to go on, right? But it's just we'll have to treat our knowledge base, our base of skills, our education, more like milk than like wine. Which wine, of course, ages a little bit more gracefully than milk on a shelf, and continuing to learn, right? The AWS leadership principle of learn and be curious applies so perfectly throughout this entire process. And having a cloud enablement engine or a cloud center of excellence puts the organizational framework in place for folks to be able to take their learnings from each stage of this process and apply it to what they're going to do next.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point. I mean, when we talk about that rubber band effect of environments in the cloud, the only place I really see that is EUC, and that's about it. But when we're talking about the infrastructure, I mean, you brought up a great point. I mean, we're never really bursting services from the infrastructure. It's not like all of a sudden I need to toss in another DNS server because there's a load of DNS lookups. It's just something that doesn't happen. But it's funny because it keeps on tying back that methodology. When you bring in HR, your IT support staff, their focus is now going to be changing and be different. Like you said, bringing up the point of, how do I make this environment more optimized to save on those costs, and what services, again, what are native to AWS that I can flip out from just running a virtual machine or, a networking device? How can I do those things differently? And that's where you enable that IT team to support this environment to take that next step in their knowledge. It's not, it's a lot of, I remember when cloud first started coming around, everybody's like, oh, everybody's going to lose a job because we're putting everything in cloud. No, it's shifting your knowledge. You have to evolve. I mean, that's been in technology for so long now. I ran a BBS system way back in the day with a couple of friends in the basement. So the technology has morphed and changed as we go along. So these are things that you evolve with it. And that's what cloud does. Cloud now takes that knowledge level to another way of thinking things, another way of addressing the services you're providing to your business users and to the corporation itself, to make sure you're you're in that right strategy and aligned with your management and business goals to be able to provide them the success they need at the business level, just within the services you're given in their cloud infrastructure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we look at like all these factors that go into what could potentially be the total cost of ownership of a solution. And there are certain things that they're very, very concrete, which is like, what are we spending per month? And then there are certain things that are much more ephemeral, right? Like, what is the value? Can we put a monetary value on agility? Yeah. Can we put a monetary value on security? I think many organizations probably do not have the level of visibility and of self-knowledge about their own operations. But if they dive a little bit deeper to understand what some of these legacy practices, what some of this tech debt is actually costing the business in a real dollars perspective, these migrations become like a no-brainer. It goes from, I'm not sure if the cloud is right for us, to how soon can we get started?
Yeah. And I mean, and honestly too, from a cloud standpoint, that investment and that savings, you don't see that day one. Those are things, and that's the other thing I try to help customers understand, is you do see it as you evolve within the cloud. You're not going to see it in day one. So everybody goes sticker shock and freaks out. But it's like, look, once you compare this again from the cost standpoints of what you're running today and how you're operating, you're going to see that over year 1, 2, 3, you're going to see that cost savings. And again, to your point, you're morphing those services on your infrastructure side of the house where you see additional savings on it. So it's there. It's just not immediately from day one that people need to understand.
Nearly every single one of our customers, like 2 to 1, reports seeing more ROI the longer they're in the cloud and the more work that they're doing, right? So exactly to your point, like day one, it may be more costly than you expected, but day 366, hopefully you're already starting to recoup some of that value. So it's about like where you fix your eyes to the horizon, right? Are they, is it going to be 6 inches in front of your toes, or is it really going to be on the horizon? Yeah. And it's important to fix your eyes, I think, on the horizon. And one of the things that Andy Jassy has said so many times, and it rings so true, is like the number one factor that he sees in successful cloud migrations is a top-down executive mandate to say, we must do this. Like, we're going to do this, and I don't care. It's time to go. So, with this kind of stuff, and if you're really even just getting started, like, the best time to start was yesterday, and the second best time is right now to get started on, the cloud adoption framework, to get started on doing some of these assessments, and don't be afraid. Like, jump in with both feet, rip that Band-Aid off, start learning, because the faster you move, the better off you are long term.
Yep. So let's see here. There's some examples of defining those success metrics. I'm a huge person that loves the metrics. I want to know how I can measure these things. I do it across the board for everything. I've learned that when I worked for a software partner a long time ago. You need to see that business value side of it. So I need to have measurements as I go along to make sure I'm hitting that value. And if not, it gives me a pivot point, and I know why I'm pivoting because I have those numbers to back up what I'm doing. I also know there's some freedom to it, but it's nice having those metrics out there. And then
there's no CIO on the planet who at the end of the year gets to go into executive board review and they're like, what did you do? And he or she just puts his feet up on the desk and goes, well, we went to the cloud, right? Like it has to be connected to something. So connecting those metrics, whether they're observable or measurable, connecting those metrics to everything that we do continues to help us go back and revise that business case. That business case, should really be like a living document, because we're going to learn things about ourselves, and we're going to learn things about the cloud that's going to adjust, what our business plan is, what we're actually going to be saving the more that we learn. So, the metrics need to be set at the beginning in terms of what's the business value that we're expecting to get out of that. And then the dimension of those metrics, I think, will change over time.
Oh yeah, definitely agree. And there's the additional tools here that help out with that. Like I was just showing here, the um, qualifying some of the cloud benefits here, going through some additional stuff. Now we're talking about improving migration cost visibility and predictability, and this is in the Mobilize phase. So what we're really talking about here is making sure that we're aligning, am I correct, with our migration and what we saw in the beginning and where we're going?
Yes, yes. We're one of the things that we're going to realize as a benefit as soon as we start moving into the cloud is we are going to have a level of observability and granular level detail into what certain things are costing us, and that will help us modify our roadmap. Like, I don't think that there are many IT organizations, especially in the SMB space or the K-12 space or the state and local government space, who could tell you, like, what is the cost per database transaction that we have in an on-premises environment? What is the cost per DNS lookup that we have on our on-prem DNS server? But we are going to be able to see that inside of AWS. So that's going to give us a lot more data that we'll be able to use to continue to fiddle with those knobs and tweak our architecture, tweak our application deployment strategy to do this really cost effectively. And so we have things like AWS budgets and cost anomaly detection to alert us when things are going to be perhaps costing more than we had anticipated. But we also have things like the cost intelligence, KPI dashboard, trusted advisor, these other things that will point out opportunities for us to save additional money, whether that's reserved instances and saving plans or unused resources or things like that.
And this also helps out with another thing that I think a lot of people don't understand about cloud when they're moving into it from an IT management standpoint, is you now get to build out charge back to departments for those IT costs. Where today, a department comes in and sales says, we need this solution. You got to implement it. IT's got to find a budget for it. We're going to stand it up. We're going to set it up, and we're going to incur the cost to support this environment. And then that's siloed. But let's say marketing comes in and they need the same solution, but marketing needs their requirements. So now that's siloed. So now when I'm at a cloud side of the house and being able to track these costs, I can now turn around and say, yeah, we can provide you those services, and here's what your charge is going to be. And now IT starts to become a money-making machine internally to the company.
Yeah, and that's why it's really important during the later stages of the assess phase and in that mobilize phase to come up with a good cost allocation strategy and a good tagging strategy, right? What are the metrics that we want to try to derive from our resource consumption inside of AWS? Is it a scenario similar to what you described, right? Which is like, we would really love to be able to report back to the organization what each new demand generation campaign that marketing runs actually puts as a cost burden on IT. We would love to be able to tell what each new microsite that we stand up is actually deriving out of our or driving our increased IT costs. And it's not only going to help the information systems department optimize their own performance and their own resource consumption, but it's going to provide an incredible level of detail back to the organization to really start to understand where can they be most profitable and where do they need to invest.
Definitely. And I'm a huge proponent for that too, because IT always gets kicked around as a redheaded stepchild because they're the ones that cost the most money. I mean, way back in the day, IT was associated with the accounting department. That's so, there's that natural marriage of money and technology together, and it's always been that way.
Yeah, so it's sort of like looking at your car payment every month and seeing that as a true cost without incorporating the fact that you're also an Uber driver and extracting some value back out of that, right?
Yeah.
It's not a pure cost. It's driving business value.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. I like that analogy there. So from there, once we've gotten that visibility and the predictability within it, now we can start optimizing and maximizing our ROI, which we've pretty much been discussing here, and being able to utilize some of these additional tools. And again, I do find it funny, until you brought it up, I never really associated I'm not bursting. I'm not, ballooning up and down on the infrastructure side of the house. And again, that comes from a lot of my experience with EUC. It is natural for people just to say, oh, we're going to be able to handle that fluctuating the infrastructure costs as users demand come up, like seasonal and stuff. But the infrastructure side from that is never really going to change. That's always there. So that's why you've got to evaluate, what other solutions are out there. And again, that helps to maximize that ROI for the organization. So
yeah, you can't, from an on-prem perspective, like you can't take a pizza that's been cut into 8 slices and cut it into 16 slices and expect to feed more people. Yeah. Right. So on the infrastructure side, we've got like a set amount of resources, but that's not the case inside of AWS, right? In an on-premises environment, if you want to add another writer node to your database because you've got a lot of write intensive workloads, or you're adding a reader node because you've got read intensive workloads, that's going to be a slice out of the same pie that you're already operating out of. But that's not the case with AWS. So it's time to start thinking about what do I actually need to provision as a bare minimum, and where am I able to burst? Mm-hmm. And one thing that as we're talking about modernization, that I really feel remiss if we didn't talk about, is one of my favorite things that AWS has released in the past probably year and a half, is a service called Babelfish. And Babelfish is this intermediary database translation layer that will natively take SQL queries from your Windows application and convert that to MySQL. So now I can get out of costly proprietary database licensing without making any changes to my application code. Like that's one of the easy, like turnkey ways that I can start modernizing my infrastructure. Now I'm turning down the amount of proprietary database licensing that I'm paying for. And again, taking that ROI, using that to add additional inertia into the flywheel. And now maybe I can go start to look at re-architecting or modernizing my applications, taking .NET stuff off .NET and into .NET Core. And the more Linux workloads I have, the more I'm able to take advantage of Graviton, which is going to give me incredible price performance versus x86 architecture, going to give me incredible price performance versus the amount of proprietary licensing that I was paying for. And oh, by the way, with the reduced amount of power that I'm actually consuming, if my organization has ESG goals, my carbon footprint for my workloads has decreased dramatically.
Nice. Babelfish, you said that was?
Babelfish.
I'm gonna have to take a look into that one. Yeah, so what we've got into here now is, once we get into that migration phase and taking a look at it, and like you're saying here with the Babelfish side of the house, storage lifecycle policies, being able to optimize some of that. Really, we go into a graphic here where it discusses those phases: the assess, mobilize, migrate, modernize. And I think it's pretty simple. I mean, I know there's a lot of words at what we started out with here, but I think this sums it up really nice as far as, these are these 3 approaches we're going to take. And then within there's those 4 different types of items that we need to punch down within those. And that's, see, save, plan, and run. And we want to make sure that we don't stay stagnant in a planning phase. And we don't want to stay stagnant in that run phase. We want to get out of those to be able to take those next steps. So I definitely like this as far as the methodology and approach here of what we're looking at. So, I mean, when we talk about these solutions and getting into the cloud, I don't think you can get much easier than breaking it down how you guys have specifically in this blog here too.
Yeah. And, as we close out here, one thing I want to impress upon the audience is another thing that Andy Jassy's said in a couple interviews, which is there is no compression algorithm for experience, right? AWS and its partners have been doing this for a very long time. Oh, yeah. And John, you and I as technologists would love to dive into technology and then talk about how sexy it is. But really, like, we're talking about business value outcomes here. And so what we want is our customers to be focused on the business value outcomes, and let AWS and its partners figure out, like, what's of the 24 different storage options that I might have in AWS, what's right for me. Like, you don't have to think about that. And because so much of this is delivered as a managed service, you will never have to think about it. and and really focus on what's driving value for your business, for your customers, and oftentimes that's not, monitoring your storage architecture.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, that's a great point to close it out on here. I do appreciate your time today, Brian, discussing this. And I want to open it up to anybody. If you have any questions, please feel free to respond online. We'll get those addressed as they come up. I know some of the stuff we'll be posting this later to our YouTube page. So once we get that up there, you can comment, give us some feedback, and then we'll make sure we can get it back. And Brian, I think this is going to be really fun. I'm looking forward to this. I know this is our first time working out on this, but we're looking at a regular cadence of about every 2 weeks for a posting. I think there's a lot of good information out there that can be shared with the community, especially around AWS. Like you said, you guys have been the workhorse. You've been out there longer. You were the model that everybody else built off of. And now it's kind of, it's like remembering that really cool toy when you were a kid. And it was, was it the Toy Story? He loves Woody, and then all of a sudden Buzz Lightyear comes in and he's now the cool toy. And then all of a sudden I realize, hey, there's a lot of good memories here with Woody. Let's go back to that. So I think people are starting to come back to AWS for that understanding that you guys know what you're doing. I mean, this isn't a no-brainer. It's not like you guys just built out a cloud and pushed it out yesterday. It's been around for a while and proven technologies. So what we'll do here is we'll continue on. I mean, I would like to maybe have one session where we cover some of these things like Babelfish and go through that. I think that would be interesting to cover those. But again, Brian, I appreciate your time, and I look forward to our next one. And everybody else, I appreciate you for listening in with us today.
Yeah, there's so much here to unpack, and we could do a deep dive on just about anything that we discussed, and would love to hear audience feedback on anything that you'd like us to dive deep on out of anything that we covered today or anything that we didn't. So lots of cool stuff to talk about, and I'm looking forward to doing this with you.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian.
All right. Thanks, John.